Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. And this week I had a friend who's also a viewer confess that she did not really understand or know the difference between cool and warm colors. And I thought that she's probably not the only one. And since I use that terminology a lot and probably will continue to, I thought it might be helpful if we talked about cool and warm colors and what that means for those of us who quilt. So stay with me. So color theory and color terminology is far more complicated than most people realize. And the words that we use to describe color can vary widely between graphic designers and video producers and people who are in print media and fabric designers. So there's a whole lot of terminology and it can mean different things to different people. But one thing that's pretty common and pretty widely used is the concept and term cool colors and warm colors. In fact, I've actually already used that term or that phrase when I talk about sorting my fabric, because I have totes and they're now completely overflowing, but I have a warm colored fabric bin and a cool colored fabric bin, and then I have a bin for neutrals. So let's talk about that. And the best way to talk about it is also for me to show you. So let's start with cool. As I was talking to my friend about cool and warm colors, I started off by saying that the cool colors on the color wheel are green, blue, and purple. So I'm actually motioning like there's a color wheel right here, which there isn't. So let's imagine at the top, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, which is roughly the pantheon of color. And so half of the color wheel is considered cool. Now that's well and good, but what does that mean? And the thing about that phrase, cool, it's a physical response. So what I did, I hope you can see here on my desk, I picked a bunch of blue fabrics, blue, blue-green, and then like a purpley blue. And I don't know about you, but when I look at this array of fabrics, I just go, oh. It's just very calming and soothing. It reminds me of the beach or the ocean. There's a blue in here that kind of reminds me of a really pretty sky. This one kind of looks like storm clouds, this one too. And so it's kind of like you have you can imagine the physical feeling if you were hot on a summer day and you went into your backyard and you had a really nice clean pool, swimming pool, and just that feeling of getting in the water, like, oh, it's cool and it's soothing. And color has that power. And if you're like me and you have any sort of imagination at all, you can see the ocean in this palette. You can see what the bottom of a pool looks like. It might remind you of rain or just that whole water-based experience in life. And for most people, that is it's not a big jump to feel cool when you see those colors. And so they're generally speaking in the blue family. In opposition to that are the warm colors. And so I'm going to get those out for you. So laid out before me are the warm colors. And so again, on our color wheel, that's red, orange, and yellow. And in talking to my friend, we talked about how if you're hot and want to cool off, you can imagine jumping into a pool or the ocean or whatever. Likewise, if you have a chill, have you ever had a chill and you come home and if you're lucky enough to have a fireplace and the colors of the fire and the warmth that you physically feel being in that is this color palette. So if you think of a flame and everything around it, so the embers in the wood, the flame itself. Now we won't go into like a gas flame on your stove because it's blue. So that doesn't count. But like wood burning fire is this color palette. So it's yellow, oranges, red, and then even on into kind of like a deeper red and burgundy and browns to a certain extent, although we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so when you imagine that warmth, the warmth of the sun, the warmth of the fireplace or fire or campfire, it's in this color palette. And you can, again, without a lot of work, physically feel that based on a color palette. And so that's the warm color palette. Now, that is so fantastic. And if that were the end of the story, then matching colors in your quilt or putting colors away, putting fabrics away in your totes would just be so easy. And there would never be any question about, does this fabric work? Does this fabric not work? So I want to talk to you. I'm going to bring my blues back out and we're going to look at these and talk about kind of where some things can go wrong. All right, so there they are all together. I did not put a lot of green or purple, but you can imagine that there. And I said how it can go wrong. Wrong is not the right word. Challenging matching up fabrics is probably a better description. And what's tricky about that is even within any one of these colors, other colors can influence it. So one color by itself, this is orange, but you put another orange up against it and you see there's a pretty big difference between this orange and this one. And let's put another one. Now you might call this red, I call this orange, which is another one of the challenging things. Color is kind of in the eye of the beholder, but you can see right away there is a really big difference between these oranges. This one is more in the yellow family. This one is more in the red family. And this one is just a little bit more muted than both of them. Working, let's make an orange quilt. Well, which one? Which orange? Do we want yellow orange? Do we want true orange, whatever that is? Do we want a pinky orange? Do we want a red orange? The more you understand about color, in many ways, the more, I don't want to say difficult. I really don't like the word difficult, but it's really true. The more it opens up challenges for matching it up. Same with blue. These are very green blues. Obviously, they're on the green spectrum. This is purple. But even within this blue has a little more of a purple tone. These obviously are more green. This one is kind of, it almost has some green in it, even though if you're looking at this to the video, you're probably like, that's blue. But if you were to look closely at the white stripe, it's really not a true white. And so because of that color up against the others, it influences the way the other colors look, which is one of the things about working with color. Color in context is different than just a single color by itself. And for quilters in particular, we use a lot of patterned fabric or prints. So that's florals and paisley and polka dots and stripes and plaids. And the more colors that you have in any given fabric, the colors within the fabric influence the overall feel of that fabric. So I'm going to stop for a second and I want to show you what I mean with some specific examples. So let's start with this one. I had this in my cool tote and it was next to the greens. I consider this green. It is a complicated green. You might be saying, I would call that yellow. And it's because it's a very yellow based green. Let's look at this one by contrast. That is very, very green. There's no doubt that is green. But it is actually a very blue green. And I'll show you how I know this. Let's look at these together. So first of all, oof, ooh, together, yee, horrible clash. That's not to say that you couldn't use these together, because sometimes those really jarring combinations can actually make for really interesting and beautiful quilts. So do not hear me say that. But this is a very blue-based green. This is a very yellow-based green. And for most people, that will give you that feeling like something's not right. If I pull this fabric that has a more spot-on green, there's actually two greens in here. There's this one, this darker one next to this little girl, that is green with a hint of blue. And then there's this other kind of grass green that has just a hint of yellow. Now look at that together. I probably still wouldn't do this because I'm pretty persnickety, but it does blend these two. So this is on the blue spectrum. This is on the yellow spectrum. So I would call that a warm green, and I would call this a cool green. And so you can see what I mean about the color wheel. It's not that simple because green is considered a cool color, but this one is very warm and this one is very cool. And it's because it has a blue undertone, whereas this one has a very, very yellow undertone. So much so that you might call it yellow. But let's do this just for funsies. Let me show you. Here is a yellow, yellow. And now all of a sudden that looks much more green, to me at least. But you can see this is how the rainbow works, which isn't the rainbow just the best thing in the world? It's amazing. Colors in and of themselves have a description, but then when they're used with each other, the colors around them influence how your eye receives that information. So suddenly this doesn't look as blue and this doesn't look as yellow because it's got this blender in between. Now, if I went one further and put my blue, I'm not sure I have a good blue to go on the edge of that. Look at that. Isn't that lovely? Now, this looks so much more green because there's a blue next to it. This looks so much more green because there's a yellow next to it. So even though I would call these cool, probably call this cool, and these warm, but that's really kind of green. Does that make sense? So let's do another example, and this time we're going to go red. All right, so here are two fabrics that are not controversially red. They are just red. Anyone who saw that would call that red. But this red is just slightly more blue than this red. This one is, it's a little bit lighter, obviously, but it's just a little bit, there's just a little bit more toward the orange family. And let me show you. So there's this, and then there's this. Do you see how those are closer? They're both red. Let's do it in the middle. This one is closer to this color than this one is. Now, this is a jump, so I'm asking a lot of you as a viewer. This one is actually closer to purple. Now, that's a big jump. That is a big jump. If I had had a wine fabric that I could put in between, it might help make that. Let's see if I do have that. Here we go. So this one has more blue undertones because it's moving toward the purple side of the spectrum. This one has less blue and is moving toward orange. If we pulled that kind of yellowy orange, you can see how that would go. There it is. There's the rainbow again. And actually, there's another color that needs to go in between these two. But that's neither here nor there. I didn't have that in my stash. Reds can have a blue undertone or they can have a yellow undertone. Most colors can be influenced with or by the colors on either side of them in the rainbow. So one last example. I lied. I did actually have something in that color, but it wasn't solid. This is kind of a reddish purple. This is obviously that purple that I cannot seem to shake on this channel. And then in between is like a plum mulberry. And so this is warm or warmer. This is much cooler. Do you see that? This would be something that you would expect to see in the embers of your fire. This would not be. This would be like rain clouds that had been building all afternoon before the whole sky opens up and dumps full of rain. But you put them together, this would be the blender fabric. So suddenly these two without that do not work together. With this in the middle, this has a little bit more red in it. This has a lot of red in it. And this has a lot of blue in it, and it blends. When I put my colors together, I put my fabrics together for quilts, and it's especially true for those of us that use thrifted fabric like men's shirts or pillowcases or other linens. Those fabrics that we have to choose from were not designed to go together. So when you buy a charm pack or a jelly roll or a pre-cut quilt kit, the reason why it works is those fabrics were designed by a graphic designer, quilt fabric designer, usually with some artistic experience, to marry well together. Even if there's maybe an outlier here or there, make it interesting, they've been designed to go together. So no matter how you piece them together, they'll work. When you're working with your own fabrics and your stash or your scraps or thrifted fabric, it introduces that now you've got to figure out how to make them work on your own. And so understanding cool colors and warm colors together helps you make good fabric decisions. So that is really the kind of crux of the cool and warm. However, there's one other thing that we've got to talk about. Not one other thing, two other things. Before me, right here before me, again, warm color, cool color, but you may notice they are not as vibrant as the fabrics that I had out before it. These fabrics are more muted. This is one of those terms that is different in every field that uses color theory. So some people call this tone, some people call this muted, some people call this saturation. There's a lot of different terms. I say muted because it makes sense to me. The core issue of muted is really that each of these fabrics has a little gray in it. The more gray, the more muted it becomes. And so you might even say dull. I don't really like that word because I don't want to be associated with anything dull. but muted makes sense. And you can see that when we do, like if I put, here is a vibrant primary yellow. So like when you're a little kid and somebody hands you a yellow crayon, that's probably pretty close. You can see instantly these are both yellow, but there is a big difference between these yellows. This one has more gray, and so it is more muted. It's a more neutral yellow as opposed to a more primary bright yellow. And that is true for every one of these colors. So this is a more muted burgundy. This is a more muted kind of an orange. Same here. So each one of these, and the reason why I pulled this white is to show you that even white fabrics with a color in them, this is more muted than a primary yellow gingham. Both of them would have white, both of them have yellow in them, but this yellow is a more neutral and muted yellow than what you would traditionally think of. Same thing here. These are obviously all blue. This is a white with a blue pattern. This has so much gray in it that I had a very hard time putting this away in my fabric stash, because when I first took it out, I was like, oh, that goes with the grays. And I went to put it in my gray bin and it's blue. And then I picked it up and I went to put it in the blue bin and it looked too gray. And so that's the case. This is another one exactly like that. You may remember this blue linen. Whew, love it so much. This is another one that's exactly like that. It has so much gray in it. Some people would actually call this gray, but it's a very blue gray. And then this fabric is almost like a navy, but it has so much gray in it that it reads in the gray family. Now, when colors are muted in the warm family, a lot of times they read, even though it's more gray, they read a little more brown. And in the blue family, colors that are muted read a little more gray. That's not always true, but that's been my experience. If you see this and you go, I get that this looks gray, but that doesn't look gray, it might help you to think of it as the muted is a little bit more brown in it as opposed to gray. But you can see, again, let me show you this. These are the primary colors. These are the more muted colors. And then really our last thing, let's talk about neutrals. So give me a sec and I'm going to get those out. Neutrals are exactly what you know them to be. They do not have a color value specifically like blue, red, yellow, etc. So grays and browns are what I'm talking about. Now, white and black, I still call neutrals, at least for my channel. Some people would say they are independent of the color wheel. There's actually a lot of discussion about where to put black and white in color theory. So we're just not even going to cover that. We're going to talk about tans and grays. Again, I have an array of neutrals. This one is a cream color that actually has, it's almost a copper. Little pluses on it. It's a really lovely fabric, actually. This is a men's shirt that I would call tan. And then this is a micro gingham that is tan. Now, this in my stash, and here we go again with a piece of fabric or color by itself. When I first got this, I would have called this tan. And you might be thinking, it's gray. And it's because it's also gray. So when I put it up against this kind of gray, it looks tan. But when I put it up against this tan, it looks gray. Does that make sense? So it really, tans and grays and neutrals, actually that is lovely together, are very much contextual. If you saw my video on the color choices I made for my fall quilt, I actually talk about that very thing. I had a tan that I wanted to use, but when I put it with the oranges and reds and golden fabric of the quilt, it did not look tan. It looked gray. It was in the gray family. It was too blue for that color palette. So you can see here, I have arranged this from warmest to coolest. This dark gray, and actually it's almost exactly the color of my shirt, is a very blue charcoal gray. This gray also has a lot of blue in it, but when I put it with another one of my grays, it can look green. Grays can be tricky that way. They can lean blue, they can lean green. And sometimes you have to be careful with putting, just because it's gray does not mean it's going to go with all your other grays. You can see how if I went even further, this would be onto black. And then if I went even further this way, this could go cream and then onto white. This one, for example, is in the middle. It's very hard to know what to call that. Is that gray? Is that tan? And so when you're pairing your other colors with your neutrals, and sometimes you can do a neutral quilt like this and it's really lovely because you can do an ombre effect with it, and a lot of times neutrals will really mix well with each other. I think this is actually, I'm sitting here going, wow, why don't I make a quilt with all these fabrics? But you can see how if I chose, for example, a very vibrant yellow, that might not go with every one of these. The closer I get to this cool side, it seems to really match a little better. Do you see that? Look, I just want to go, but when I put it over here, this kind of tan, this has got some copper in it, it doesn't work as well. We could do that with all different, all kinds of different fabrics. So here's a Here's an orange. That works much better. Look at that. So look at these two pairings. So the copper in this cream color, and this is muted. This is a more muted orange than this very vibrant yellow. This is actually a pretty, even though I wouldn't necessarily call gray vibrant, but you put them together and look how lovely that is. So sometimes working with color, like I said in the beginning, it's really not as simple as cool and warm. These are both warm. They would be considered warm colors, but then put them in context. This works better with the cool side. This works better with the warm side. As we move forward in other videos, and of course the ones that I've made so far, and especially when I start talking about plaid, and I lay out a bunch of fabric, if I say cool, what I mean is that blue family of fabrics, whether they're muted or vibrant. And when I say warm, what I mean is that array of red to yellow, whether they're warm or whether they're muted or vibrant. Please don't feel any kind of way about it. This is one of those things that it's like, you may learn your colors growing up, but if you don't have a reason to have specific teaching in this, this is just something that, you may not have been able to visualize without seeing it for yourself. So I hope this video has been helpful for you to understand cool and warm colors. This is the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. Thank you so much for watching.